Welcome to the Key Chapters of the Bible podcast. This is a daily podcast that's going through the key chapters of God's Word. Well, today we're turning to the book of Nehemiah. Like our podcast from Ezra chapter 9 and 10, this podcast is going to be a combination of Nehemiah's chapters 1 and 2, and we're even going to go a little bit into chapters 4 and 6 as we read about Nehemiah rebuilding the walls. And then one of my favorite chapters of the entire Bible is Nehemiah chapter 8. We'll look at that in a couple days from now. Let's go to the background of the book of Nehemiah. The book of Nehemiah takes place starting around 445 BC. This would be the 20th year of the reign of the Persian king Artaxerxes. And although the focus of this book is kind of on rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem, that's how people normally understand this book, the backdrop of this book is continuing to unfold the drama of the nations. You'll remember that Assyria rose to power about 300 years earlier and defeated the northern kingdom in 722 BC. Later on, Babylon rose to power and defeated Assyria and eventually defeated the southern kingdom in 586 BC. Then Persia rose to power and defeated Babylon in 539 BC. And then the return of the exiles begins in 538 BC. The first Persian emperor was named Cyrus. Then came an emperor not named in the Bible named Cambyses, then Darius, then Xerxes, who was married to Queen Esther, and then Artaxerxes, who is mentioned here in Nehemiah. Now, Artaxerxes was generous with Ezra in the book of Ezra when Ezra returned, and Artaxerxes gave him all kinds of financial backing for the temple. And we're going to see here that the Artaxerxes then blesses the Jews with rebuilding the walls. And so one of the key principles of both the books of Ezra and Nehemiah is that God could and would work in the Gentiles to allow his plan to unfold. Well, let's see the unfolding of God's plan here in the book of Nehemiah and how God works in this whole situation to accomplish his will. Going into Nehemiah chapter 1, verse 1 opens with this first-person account of Nehemiah. Now, Nehemiah probably wrote this book around 425 BC, about 20 years after these events actually occurred. In verse 1, he's a servant of King Artaxerxes. He's in the capital city of Susa. And just this statement alone shows how entrenched he is in the Persian system because he doesn't bother to tell us where Susa is. In case you're wondering, Susa is in modern-day Iran, about 150 miles north of the Persian Gulf. It's now called Shush, and it still has the tomb of Daniel there. So Nehemiah is in Susa, serving the king as a cupbearer that we're going to find out is a cupbearer in verse 11. And a cupbearer is a person who serves the king kind of like a trusted butler. And he was there to protect the king as well as taste the king's food so that if he keeled over first, the king would know, that food's been poisoned. So Nehemiah is a cupbearer to King Artaxerxes, and in verse 32, Nehemiah's brother pays him a visit. Apparently his brother has news of Jerusalem, so Nehemiah asks him, what's going on over there? Nehemiah's brother doesn't have good news for him. He said the people who had stayed there during the exile were in great distress and reproach. He said the walls that surround Jerusalem are broken down, its gates have been burned with fire. Now, a city without walls would be extremely vulnerable to the surrounding dangers and the other nations and other people. And Nehemiah is just stunned to think that the place so important in the plan of God would be in such despair. So this hits Nehemiah like a ton of bricks. He flops down, he starts to weep, and he weeps for several days, and he fasts and prays to God. And he tells the content of his prayer starting in verse 5. He starts out praying to God and praising God for his covenant faithfulness. He just recognized that God is a God of loving kindness to his people who keep his commandments. But then he confesses he and Israel were in fact guilty of breaking God's commandments. He says, we have sinned against you. And he says, I and my father's house have sinned. He says, we have acted very corruptly against you. So he does not come to God with any sense of deserving God's grace, but just coming to God knowing he is a God of mercy. And so Nehemiah asked the Lord to remember his covenant with Moses, that not only would he bring judgment upon them if they sinned, but if they repented and returned to him, he also promised to draw them back to the place where he chose them to be. And so Nehemiah's prayer here is essentially asking the Lord to restore the people back to the land. Well, that closes out chapter 1. Now let's go to chapter 2. Chapter 2 opens with Nehemiah in the presence of the king Artaxerxes. Remember, he's the cupbearer for the king. Now Nehemiah is sad, and so the king says, why are you so sad? And Nehemiah has the boldness here in verse 3 to say, let the king live forever. Why should my face not be sad when this city, the place of my father's tombs, lies desolate and its gates to be consumed by fire? Now, these words are a pretty big deal. If you think about really who is talking here, Nehemiah is an exiled Jew. His people were defeated by the Babylonians. They're essentially still being defeated by the Persians. And this is a bit like Nehemiah saying to the king, hey, why wouldn't I be so sad when your people are so rotten to my people? Well, amazingly, King Artaxerxes shows favor to Nehemiah and says, well, what's your request? And I love what Nehemiah says in verse 4. He says, so I prayed to the God of heaven. It's one of those quick popcorn prayers where Nehemiah only has a moment to ask for God's help, but he does because he just knows that this is only going to work if God is helping him. And here we see that God does even answer these popcorn prayers because he does bless this whole situation. And so Nehemiah asked the king for permission to go back to Jerusalem and rebuild it. They work out the details, and King Artaxerxes not only grants his request, but he even gives him a letter to procure the supplies. And all of this Nehemiah attributes to the Lord, saying at the end of verse 8, the good hand of my God was upon me. And so God's hand was on Nehemiah, and he arrives in Jerusalem in verse 11. He goes around and he inspects the city at night. He goes and just checks out the city walls and their condition. And then in verse 17, he gathers the people together and explains their situation. In verse 18, he explains how God's hand was upon him and blessed his work. And clearly this is a situation the Lord wanted him to do. And most everyone seems to be pretty supportive, except for a guy named Sanballat who mocks him. Now Nehemiah answers Sanballat saying, the God of heaven will give us success. Therefore we are his servants and will arise and build. But you have no portion, right, or memorial in Jerusalem. Well, Nehemiah was right. God would give him success. And so Nehemiah then commences to lead the people in rebuilding the walls. If we were to read chapters 3 and 4 and 5 and 6, we'd find out that Nehemiah assigned families to sections to work on. He oversaw their work. And they're all this time going to be facing opposition from Sanballat and Tobias and others. Sanballat and Tobias ridiculed them and their strength and their wisdom and their trust in God, saying that this wall was so fragile a fox could crumble it. And all of this, Nehemiah pressed forward, leading the people. The situation at one point got so bad that people had to have a sword in one hand and a trowel in the other. They struggled with supplies. They struggled with getting the details done. But Nehemiah kept encouraging them, saying, remember the Lord, great and awesome. He says that in chapter 4:14. Throughout all of this, Nehemiah organized just this whole team to work on the building and work on protecting, work on guarding, work on supplying. And the whole time he kept telling the people, like he did in chapter 4, verse 20, our God will fight for us. Well, Nehemiah was correct. And in Nehemiah chapter 6, they complete the wall. And everyone can see in chapter 6, verse 16, that this work was done by our God. So it took them 52 days to build the wall. 52 days to work together, devise the plans, organize, delegate, and operate, and 52 days to bring about the full completion of the walls. According to Josephus, this wall was 20 feet wide, 16 feet high, and 4 miles in circumference. This is huge. This project required all the people to give up what was going on in their personal lives, their daily jobs like farming, just make sacrifices at every turn to see this project to completion. And they were successful because God's hand was upon them. So that's these two chapters, and they're key chapters for a few reasons. For one thing, it's important just for us to see the restoration of Jerusalem after the exile. This restoration did not come like a flick of a switch. It came in 3 waves. First, under Zerubbabel in 538 BC to rebuild the temple, then under Ezra in 457 BC to rebuild the people, and here under Nehemiah to rebuild the walls in 445 BC. Just as their deportation took several waves, so did their restoration. Likewise, we continue to see God's favor upon the Jews through the Gentile nations. Remember, the restoration began with the benevolence of King Cyrus. Now it continues through King Artaxerxes. Amazingly, these Gentile rulers were more obedient to God's plans than Israel's own kings. We're seeing here the truth behind Proverbs 21, verse 1, which says, the king's heart is like channels of water in the hand of the Lord. He turns it wherever he wishes. And so we're just seeing that that's what God is doing right here through Artaxerxes. We're also seeing what God can do through a man who is simply submitted to God and believes God can do anything. Remember, Nehemiah's primary skill was trustworthiness, integrity, and a willingness to eat food that might kill him. As far as we know, he was not a construction expert or a military leader or anybody else, really just a humble man who believed God. And yet God used him to oversee this complex, massive building project in less than ideal circumstances, and he led the people to complete the project in 52 days. Nehemiah believed God, he rose to the need, and God used him for it. And so that's our study for today. As we finish out our time, let's just praise God for working in frail people such as you and I. The battle belongs to the Lord. It is not us who does the work. It is God who does it through us. And as we submit our lives to him, our will to him, our strength to him, he will guide us and enable us to accomplish his will. So as we finish up our time, how about going to the Lord in prayer and just laying all of this before Him and just asking Him to give you the eyes and the faith and the grace to see the needs around you, that you might rise on up and be part of their solution. That's a great prayer, just to submit ourselves before the Lord, to be available to Him, whatever He would call us to do, however big the project might be. Well, we'll wrap things up there. Hope you have a great rest of your day. Thanks again for listening. I hope to catch up with you tomorrow. Thanks, and God bless.